The silence of the night had deepened. At a small airport in Washington state, there was darkness and stillness all around. Suddenly a shadow flickered on the windows of a plane. Someone was slowly approaching that aircraft. He had no shoes on his feet, and no gloves on his hands. Only his cautious steps broke the stillness, so quiet that even a slight sound could alert someone. That boy slipped inside and sat in the cockpit. All the notes he had read from books and the internet, all the moves he had learned from video games, began to spin in his mind. No one had ever taught him how to fly a plane. But there was a strange obsession burning inside him. Moments later, the silence of the night was broken by the roar of an engine on the small airport's runway. The control tower was empty. No one could have imagined that a child would steal a plane like this. In an instant the plane lifted off the ground and rose into the sky. Bright streaks of light sliced through the dark night as villagers below looked up in shock. Even the police couldn't believe that this stunt wasn't pulled off by a professional pilot but by a mere 17-year-old boy. He was no ordinary thief. He was the barefoot bandit, the mysterious criminal who flew without shoes. His footprints were often found at crime scenes, and people said he always appeared barefoot. That became his identity. Police departments everywhere tried to catch him, but every time he slipped away like a movie character who always outsmarts the law. The thefts kept increasing, first food and money from homes, then cars, boats, and now even airplanes. But the most fascinating part was that people didn't hate him. Instead, they saw him as a kind of hero. The media called him the modern-day Robin Hood. Some were amazed by his cleverness and courage. Others saw him as a rebel. That night, when the FBI's wireless crackled with a message saying that a new plane had been stolen, and the pilot wasn't trained but was the barefoot bandit, the entire country was stunned. His name flooded newspaper headlines. TV channels began discussing how a teenager could repeatedly escape the police without any proper training. But the real roots of this story lay somewhere else. In a small village, under the shadow of poverty in a broken home, a boy grew up, a boy for whom the doors of school, home, and society were never opened. And that same boy one day became America's most notorious yet most famous thief. This is the story of Colton Harris Moore, known across the world as the Barefoot Bandit. A story full of thrill, chases, police failures, and the passion of a boy who fought his circumstances by choosing the path of crime. That night, with the roar of the plane cutting through the sky, the legend of the Barefoot Bandit took a new turn. His hunt was no longer just the police's duty, it became the FBI's mission. But would he ever be caught? That question echoed in everyone's mind. And from here the real story of the Barefoot Bandit began. In the small town of Camano Island, Washington, a boy was often seen running barefoot through the streets. Shoes were rare on his feet, his clothes were usually torn, and his eyes always carried a strange restlessness. That boy was Colton Harris Moore. He was born on March. His home life was broken from the beginning. His father was an alcoholic and violent. His mother was mentally and financially unstable. There was no love, care, or stability in his house, only shouting and fighting. As a result, at a very young age, Colton realized that if he wanted to survive, he would have to do it on his own. Many times his father disappeared for months. His mother, instead of working, drowned herself in alcohol. When there was nothing to eat, Colton would run off into the forest nearby and spend the night under trees, between leaves and branches. Slowly he learned the art of survival in the wilderness, which tree bark could burn, which herbs were edible, and how to endure cold nights without shelter. His school life wasn't good either. Other kids made fun of him. His clothes were dirty and he never wore shoes. Often he came to school hungry. He never paid attention in class but kept staring out the window at the trees. Teachers said, "This boy doesn't think about study. He's thinking about something else." Maybe those thoughts later shaped his life of crime. At 12, Colton tried to run away from home for the first time. The police caught him and handed him back to his mother. But just days later, he vanished again. This time he hid in the forest for several days. No one could imagine that a child so young could survive so easily on his own. Slowly, Colton began to steal. At first he only stole food, bread, milk, biscuits. Sometimes he took a flashlight or a blanket from a neighbor's house. People thought some stray animal had wandered in. But then they noticed tiny barefoot prints behind their homes. That was the first time people heard about a boy sneaking into houses and stealing the Barefoot Bandit. Neighbors often told Colton's mother that her son was stealing, but she always tried to protect him. Once she even told the police, If my son steals food out of hunger, is that his fault? The system never gave us anything. But in the eyes of the law, theft was still theft. Soon Colton was sent to a juvenile correction center, but even there he didn't stay long. He tried to escape multiple times, and often succeeded. This habit of running away, of outsmarting the system, became the signature of his life. The correctional officers wrote in their report, "Colton is intelligent but deeply troubled. He has extraordinary survival instincts. If guided properly, he could achieve something great, but he never got that guidance." By his teenage years, Colton's personality had taken a unique shape. He was introverted and didn't like to mingle with people, but he had a deep interest in machines and technology. He would collect broken computer parts and try to make them work. He read books about how engines function and how circuits connect. That passion later led him from cars to boats, and finally to airplanes. No one could have imagined that a barefoot boy with no formal education would one day trouble the FBI. His mother often defended him, saying, "He's different, he's not like others, let him live in his own world." But the truth was, Colton was slowly drifting away from normal society. The more he was caught, the more he escaped. The more he was suppressed, the more rebellious he became. People began to see him as a boy breaking the walls built by society. But for him it wasn't rebellion, it was survival. He believed the world had given him nothing, so why should he follow its rules? And this was how the foundation of the Barefoot Bandit was laid. A troubled childhood, a broken family, hunger and loneliness, all these combined to lead Colton down a road from which there was no return. Ahead of him lay bigger thefts and even bolder adventures. His barefoot steps were no longer limited to neighborhood homes, they were now heading toward the world's headlines. He was no longer just a hungry boy. He was slowly becoming a master thief. The streets of Kamano Island, where he once played barefoot, had now become his crime scenes. It all started with small thefts. Colton would sneak into neighbors' homes late at night through windows. Sometimes he would steal milk and bread from the fridge, or chips and cookies from the pantry. From some houses he took only a flashlight or a sleeping bag. At that time people thought a homeless man or some stray animal was behind it. But after every robbery, they would see muddy, barefoot footprints on the floor. Gradually people began whispering, "This must be the work of that barefoot boy." Sometimes Colton even wandered into living rooms and touched televisions or gaming consoles with curiosity. But carrying heavy things was difficult for him, so he mostly focused on stealing food and survival supplies. On one cold winter night in 2003, when a family returned from vacation, they saw their window broken. Inside everything was scattered, but the valuable items were almost untouched. The fridge was empty. Bread, milk, cheese, everything was gone, and near the door were fresh muddy barefoot prints. The family called the police. For the first time Colton's name entered the local police record. The police questioned his mother. She said, "My son is just a child. Why would he steal?" But the police were sure. Within weeks the same barefoot prints appeared at several nearby houses. Colton was only around 12 or 13 years old at that time. The police sent him to a juvenile correction home. But for Colton, that place felt more like a prison than a school. They tried to teach him discipline, but Colton always rebelled. Even there he stayed isolated from others, refused to follow the officers' orders, and then one day he tried to escape. He broke the glass window of the correction home, jumped out, and disappeared into the night. It took the officers hours to realize he was truly gone. That escape filled Colton's mind with a new kind of confidence. "I can outsmart the system." With that confidence, his thefts became bolder and more daring. He no longer stole just bread and milk but also electronic gadgets, cash, and even people's cars. Once Colton stole an expensive digital camera from a house. When the police later recovered it, they found it full of his own selfies. In one picture he was standing in the forest, a faint smile on his face, a flashlight in his hand, and his feet bare. For the police, those photos were solid evidence, but for the people, they looked like posters from an adventure movie. Slowly, the name Barefoot Bandit started spreading. Local newspapers began covering his thefts. The headlines read, "The Barefoot Burglar Strikes Again." Colton's actions began to frustrate both the police and the locals. Many times the police tried to catch him, but he always escaped. Sometimes he hid in the woods, sometimes in old sheds near the river. His survival skills were so incredible that even trained officers often got tired of tracking his footprints. Once the police cornered him deep in the forest. Colton had no weapon, but his quick thinking and speed saved him. The officers thought he was hiding on one side of the river, but Colton had already swum across to the other side. Behind him, he left only muddy footprints and a few broken branches. The barefoot bandit was no longer just a thief. He was becoming a myth. Some people said he's just a hungry boy stealing to survive. Others said no, he's a criminal. For Colton, it all felt like a game. Every time he stole from a house, he felt a thrill. He felt like he had beaten the system again. But this game had its price. The juvenile system caught him several times, but each time he escaped. His arrests and escapes appeared again and again in local newspapers. Every time his muddy barefoot prints became his signature. Now he was slowly turning from a small thief into a name known across Washington state. The image of the barefoot bandit was now set, a boy running barefoot faster and smarter than the police, always one step ahead. But this was only the beginning. Soon his targets would not just be homes and small stores. Colton's eyes were now fixed on bigger things: cars, boats, and those flying machines people watched in the sky, airplanes. Colton was no longer the boy who just stole bread or milk from a neighbor's house. His thoughts and dreams had grown much bigger. Cars, boats, and finally airplanes. The barefoot bandit's game was about to reach a dangerous level. One night in 2006, an SUV parked in the quiet area of Damon Island suddenly disappeared. By morning, the owner reported it to the police, but the car was nowhere to be found. A few days later, the same SUV was discovered miles away near the edge of a forest. The gas tank was empty, but the seats and door panels were covered in muddy barefoot prints. No one else could have done this. The barefoot bandit had once again outsmarted the police. Car thefts had now become routine for him. He often used them only to escape and would then abandon them in lonely places. But his interest was never just in the thrill or speed. It was in understanding machines. He would open up stolen car engines and study how they worked. Sometimes he even tried to repair broken parts himself. But Colton's eyes were always on the sky. Airplanes to him were the ultimate symbol of freedom. He would spend hours in internet cafes playing flight simulator games. Sometimes he stole books and manuals that explained airplane controls and flying basics. Things people needed years of training to learn. This boy was absorbing from books and games. In 2008, his dream took its first real step. At a small rural airport, the night was dark and silent. Near the runway stood a single-engine plane that had caught Colton's eye. He quietly broke the hangar lock and climbed into the cockpit. His hands trembled, but the controls from his flight simulator games were clear in his mind. He started the engine. The propeller began to spin, and the next moment the plane raced down the runway. As soon as the wheels left the ground, a storm of adrenaline rushed through Colton's chest. It was his first flight ever. The teenager who had never seen a flight school, who had never even spoken to a pilot, was now flying alone in the sky. But the lack of experience soon showed. After a short while, he lost control and the airplane crashed. The wreckage was scattered across the ground. When the police arrived at the site, they expected to find a dead body, but there was no one inside. On the nearby soil were the same familiar clues: fresh barefoot footprints. Colton had survived and escaped into the forest. The crash made national headlines. A teenager flying a stolen airplane without any training and surviving. It sounded like a movie script. Newspapers named him the Barefoot Bandit, and soon people began discussing him all over social media. Some called him a criminal, but many called him a modern-day Robin Hood. Colton secretly enjoyed this attention. Sometimes he even left funny notes at crime scenes. Once he wrote with chalk on a wall, "See you later." It became his signature. With every new theft, his confidence and daring grew. In 2009, his courage amazed everyone again. This time he not only stole an airplane but also landed it successfully. That plane too was stolen, but Colton landed it miles away in a field and vanished again. Once more the police were left with nothing. It was now clear this was no ordinary thief. The Barefoot Bandit had become an expert in mechanics, survival, and cunning. Colton's crimes were no longer limited to Washington state. He started stealing in Oregon and Idaho too. Cars, boats, airplanes, nothing was beyond his reach. Police departments began coordinating with each other, and finally the FBI joined the case. But the more the law chased him, the more he captured the public's imagination. The media began portraying him as a hero. People made Facebook pages and fan groups dedicated to him. Thousands praised him online for outsmarting even the FBI. For Colton, this chase was no longer just survival. It had become thrill and identity. Whenever he sat in a cockpit, he felt like the world was his. Whenever he drove a fast boat, he felt free from the system. But the thrill was always dangerous. Once he crashed another airplane but narrowly survived. Another time the police surrounded him, but he jumped into the water and swam away. When the officers reached the shore, they found fresh wet barefoot prints on the muddy ground. Every failed capture became an embarrassment for the police and entertainment for the public. The barefoot bandit had now become a legend. His daring could be seen in the fact that sometimes after a theft, he would buy things from local stores and pay with cash, just to show people he was no ordinary thief, but a different kind of outlaw. But the reality was that now dozens of cases were filed against him: theft, trespassing, property damage, and car theft. The FBI created special task forces to catch him, but Colton escaped safely every time. The forests were his friends. The night was his cover, and his cleverness always kept him one step ahead of the police. The story of the barefoot bandit was now being romanticized. People said he stole, but he didn't hurt anyone. He just took from the rich and lived for himself. This myth only increased his popularity. But the reality was far more complicated. Colton's childhood, poverty, broken family, all of this had pushed him toward crime. But now he was no longer just a victim of circumstances. He had become a thrill seeker who wanted to prove himself every time by outsmarting the system. In 2009 and 2010, his audacious crimes shook the authorities completely. During this period he stole and flew more than 5 airplanes. Every time after a crash landing, he vanished. Every time, only muddy barefoot prints and media headlines were left behind. Colton Harrismore was no longer the name of a small-time thief. He was a teenager being hunted by the FBI, spoken about across the United States, and imagined by people as a hero. But the higher he flew, the faster his chase became. The barefoot bandit's game was reaching its final level, and he had to face not just local police, but the entire federal system. As he ran through dense forests at night, barefoot prints were left in the mud. In the morning when the police arrived, all they saw were deep bare footprints. Sometimes a window was broken. Sometimes a car door left open. Sometimes the engine of a small airplane was gone. Gradually this mysterious criminal became headline news across America. Colton Harrismore was no longer just a runaway boy. He had become the barefoot bandit, and catching him had become a matter of police prestige. Initially, when he stole from small houses, the police dismissed him as a juvenile delinquent. But now the situation was different. He was flying planes, taking off from airstrips without training and disappearing in another state. Every move of his was breaking the law, and all of this was not the work of an organized gang or mafia. It was all being done by him, a 19-year-old boy whose pictures started appearing on news channels across America. Newspapers called him the Three Headlines, while elsewhere he was called the Barefoot Escape Artist. His barefoot prints had become his signature. People were amazed that a boy who had never received official pilot training could steal and fly planes. The FBI had now taken the case into their own hands. The chase had exceeded the local police's capacity, but for the barefoot bandit, the chase had become a game. He would steal in one place, take a car to the next city, and sometimes write messages on walls with spray paint, as if mocking the police. Once in Washington state, he stole a plane during the dark of night. In the morning when the police received the news, all that remained on the airfield was a broken gate and tire tracks. On radar, the plane was last spotted over the mountains. By the time the police scouted the area, the plane had already crashed into the forest, and Colton had escaped on foot, leaving his barefoot prints behind. Every failed capture increased the police's frustration and made the media portray him as an even bigger hero. People created Facebook fan pages for him. This chase was no longer just a matter of crime and law. It had become a spectacle of public curiosity and the system's failure. The FBI announced a reward for him, first $10,000, then $50,000. Yet people sometimes gave false tips to the police, claiming they had seen the barefoot bandit. He had become part of folklore, the story of a boy fighting the law for freedom. But the reality was far from romantic. The barefoot bandit was becoming dangerous. He would break into grocery stores at night, stealing cash and food. Several times he even took weapons and fled. The police in small towns feared that a direct confrontation could turn into a serious tragedy. They questioned his mother, Pamela, asking where Colton might be hiding. But she was helpless. She only said he always escapes. Maybe he is doing the same now. Gradually, the chase began to map across the United States. Washington, Idaho, Oregon, Montana, Nevada. Sightings of the barefoot bandit were reported everywhere. Everywhere the same pattern: car theft, airplane theft, home break-ins, and then sudden disappearance. Sometimes he deliberately led the police on a trail. Once he abandoned a stolen car in the forest, made barefoot tracks to a nearby lake, and dived into the water. The police were stuck, assuming he had crossed the lake. But in reality, Colton swam under the lake and emerged on the other side to steal another car and vanish. This chase had now become a game of cat and mouse. Specially trained tactical teams from the FBI were searching for him. But the barefoot bandit had an advantage no technology or weapon could counter: his relentless curiosity and courage to take risks. Once he flew a plane 350 miles just by reading books and watching YouTube videos. When this came to light, it caused an uproar at the FBI headquarters. An untrained teenager breaking the law and flying airplanes could cause a disaster at any moment. Now this chase was no longer just about preventing theft. It had become a national security issue. The FBI sent undercover agents to monitor his online activity. But the barefoot bandit was always one step ahead. He logged in from internet cafes, used fake IDs, and constantly changed his location. The more he escaped the police, the wider his reach became. Now he was moving from small towns to large cities and major airports, and each time the FBI tightened its grip behind him. The barefoot bandit's greatest strength was his ability to think outside the system. When the police set up roadblocks, he took the air. When airstrips were monitored, he would escape by car into the mountains. When hiding in the city was difficult, he would spend weeks in dense forests. People began comparing him to D.B. Cooper, the mysterious criminal who had eluded the police for years. But the difference was that the barefoot bandit's story was unfolding live. Every week there was a new twist. By 2010, the barefoot bandit had become a national embarrassment for the FBI. Millions of dollars had been spent, hundreds of agents involved. Yet he still roamed. Every time the police thought they had caught him, the barefoot bandit somehow escaped. Sometimes from the forest, sometimes from rivers, sometimes from the sky, as if he were controlling the entire system with his own hands. But the bigger his territory became, the faster the chase intensified. The FBI added him to the most wanted fugitives list. Now the barefoot bandit knew the game had reached its final stage. The night was deep, clouds covered the sky, and the restless, eerie silence hung in the air. For Colton Harrismore, America had become dangerous. Police, FBI, and media were all after him. Everywhere his photos were displayed. At every airport his photo was distributed. But Colton had always been drawn to the heights of the air. He felt that on the ground escaping the police was nearly impossible. But in the sky there was still space for him. In his mind there was only one plan: to escape America. For this, he had to do what he had become an expert at: stealing a plane. Colton spent several days near a small airport. He observed the runway security. He understood the guards' patterns. And most importantly, he identified a private plane. He knew this was his ticket to escape. He was not a trained pilot. But manuals, the internet, and practice had taught him enough to take a risky flight. One night, when light rain fell and the guards had grown drowsy, Colton quietly crossed the runway. His heart was pounding so fast, he felt it could be heard from far away. He reached the plane and climbed into the cockpit in his own way. His hands were shaking, but his mind was completely focused. As soon as the engine roared to life, the night's silence was broken. Colton's heart was beating in the same rhythm. He pushed the throttle forward, and the plane began to speed down the runway. In the blink of an eye, Colton Harrismore was in the sky again. This time he was not just a thief, but a fleeing human who had shocked the entire United States. But the flight was not as smooth as he had imagined. The weather was bad. The wind was strong, and Colton was struggling to control the plane. He realized that this journey would not last long. He had flown over 1,000 miles. And eventually, when he realized he was losing both fuel and control, he decided to crash land toward the Bahamas. At the first light of morning, Colton's plane crashed near the shore of the Bahamas. The wreckage was scattered, but the miracle was that Colton survived. Like a hero in a movie, he emerged from the broken plane, scratched and injured. He stood tall. And now he was in a new country, where the reach of American law was not easy. The Bahamas was more beautiful than he had imagined. Blue waters, lush green trees, docks filled with luxury yachts. But for Colton, this place was only a hiding spot. For a few days he secretly took food and essentials from the locals. But a foreigner, and the barefoot bandit at that, could not stay anonymous for long. Soon the news spread in Bahamian media that America's famous thief was now in the Bahamas. The FBI immediately offered help to the local police, and Colton realized that his time was now limited. Yet his courage did not diminish. He attempted to steal a yacht. In the dark of night, he reached the dock and started the engine of a luxury boat. His intention was to escape to another island. But this time, luck was not on his side. As the port engine roared, the Coast Guard was alerted, and the chase began. The waters of the Bahamas that night resembled a battlefield. On one side, fast boats of the FBI and Bahamian police. On the other, Colton's stolen boat. The waves crashed. Searchlights pierced the darkness, and sirens echoed everywhere. Colton pulled the throttle fully, and sped the boat ahead. In his eyes the same stubborn determination shone. "I will not be caught," he thought, but reality was different. The Coast Guard boats were slowly closing in. Gunshots could be heard as warnings fired into the water. Colton performed a sudden maneuver. He turned the boat abruptly, but in the process he lost his balance. The boat shook violently, and Colton fell into the water. Within moments the Bahamian police surrounded him. Handcuffs were placed on his wrists. The boy who had evaded the American police for years barefoot was now standing before them, drenched and exhausted. After his arrest, Colton remained silent. No complaints, no anger, just silent eyes, perhaps lost in memories of his journey. Before him now lay courts, punishments, and a long prison journey. But in that moment, by the sea before the crowd and cameras, one thing was clear. The barefoot bandit's final escape had ended here. It was a rain-soaked evening. Outside the courthouse, the media crowd had gathered. Camera flashes kept going off. People clung to the walls, as if hoping for a glimpse of a Hollywood star. But this was no movie, nor a drama of real life. Its main character was Colton Harrismore, the barefoot bandit. After his arrest, Colton was brought to the United States under strict security. This 19-year-old boy had now become the most talked-about fugitive. As the prison van entered the courthouse gates, journalists outside shouted questions. "Colton, do you regret it? Will you fly again? Is the thrill of being the barefoot bandit over?" But Colton remained silent. His hands trembled slightly in handcuffs. But on his face was the same cold smile that had even amazed the FBI. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was entirely different. The judge sat on a high chair. On the left, the prosecution's lawyers. On the right, Colton's defense. The gallery, filled with media and the public, fell silent as Colton was brought in. A thin, lean boy in a blue prison shirt. A face as innocent as a child's, but eyes that held the same rebellious spark. The prosecution spoke. They said Colton Harrismore was not just a thief. He was a national security threat. He had committed at least 100 thefts. He had broken into many homes, stolen cars and even airplanes. Flying them without training had not only caused millions of dollars in damage, but also endangered hundreds of lives. The judge listened carefully. The gallery shifted in their seats. Who could have imagined that a barefoot teenager could outsmart the FBI and the entire country for 7 years? Now it was the defense's turn. Colton's lawyer said, "My lord, Colton's childhood was unlike that of an ordinary American child. His mother was an alcoholic. His father abandoned him. Raised in poverty, hunger and neglect, he began stealing to survive. Yes, Colton made mistakes, but he is not a killer. He never intended to harm anyone. Most of his thefts were only to eat, live and hide. Stealing airplanes was his fascination, not part of any terrorist plot." Colton listened quietly, sometimes a slight smile, sometimes looking down. When the judge asked him directly, "Do you regret your actions, Colton?" he spoke for the first time. "Yes, sir. I am sorry. I scared people, stole their belongings, but I never wanted to take anyone's life. I just wanted to fly, to be free." His voice was soft but resonated throughout the courtroom. The media immediately caught it. The next day, newspapers headlined, "The barefoot bandit just wanted to fly." Colton apologized, but America was divided. Some considered him a dangerous criminal. Many saw him as a local hero, a boy who rose from poverty and outsmarted the FBI in airplanes without training. The judge took time before announcing the verdict. Several hearings took place. The crowd outside the courthouse grew larger each time. Some held "Free the Barefoot Bandit" posters. Others, families of victims, whose homes, cars, and planes were destroyed, held "Justice for Victims" signs. Finally, the day of sentencing arrived. The gallery was packed. The judge said in a serious tone, "Colton Harrismore, you broke the law and caused fear and damage to many lives. But considering your age, your difficult childhood, and the fact that you never intentionally harmed anyone, the court sentences you to 7 years in prison." Silence fell in the courtroom. Some sighed in relief, others shook their heads in anger. The media immediately reported it as breaking news. Colton showed no fear on his face. With a slight smile, he said, "At least here I can study. Maybe I will become an engineer." In fact, Colton had expressed a desire to study aviation engineering from prison. He said that when free, he would legally fly airplanes and teach other children lessons through his story. His mother, who occasionally attended the trial, was tearful. She told journalists outside, "Colton did wrong, but he is not a bad person. He just needs a chance." The trial ended, but the Barefoot Bandit's tale did not end there. His arrest and sentence made him a local legend. Documentaries were made about his story. Books were written. Hollywood even bought the film rights. As he left the courtroom, Colton looked at the cameras one last time. That innocent smile was on his lips. It seemed to say, "The Barefoot Bandit has been caught, but my flight isn't over yet." The memory of that rain-soaked morning would probably remain fresh in Colton Harrismore's mind forever. A handcuffed, tired, broken boy, once called the modern Robin Hood in newspapers, now stood under the harsh lights of the courtroom. His arrest photos, continuous footage on TV, and thousands of social media posts made him a pop culture icon. But in real life, the story of the Barefoot Bandit was about to take a new turn, the turn of incarceration. Colton's arrest divided America. Some hated him as a criminal. Others were inspired by his daring life and saw him as a modern hero. In small towns, people started selling T-shirts with his boat. Fan clubs were created online. Many saw him as a young man standing against a system that had failed him since childhood. But in the eyes of the police and law, he was a thief, and now he had to face the consequences of his action. Colton's charges were not minor. Home invasions, car theft, boat and plane theft, crimes across state lines, causing millions of dollars in damage. He faced over 30 serious charges. Lawyers clearly stated in court that he was not just seeking thrills, he was a dangerous criminal who had disrupted countless lives. But Colton's lawyers tried to present a different image. They said he was not part of organized crime or any gang. He was a child with a broken childhood, who lost his father early and lived an unstable life with his mother. He had no support, and his fascination with thrill had led him down the wrong path. The lawyers argued that Colton needed rehabilitation more than prison. The trial lasted weeks. The media covered it day and night. People often stood outside the courthouse, some with "Free Colton" posters, others demanding "Lock him forever." TV anchors called him America's teenage outlaw. Finally, the court gave its verdict. Colton Harrismore was sentenced to 7 years in prison. Silence filled the courtroom. Colton himself stood and said, "What I did was wrong. I apologize to everyone I hurt. I want to be a better person." His voice was soft, but full of visible regret. The prison years were difficult for Colton. But from there, a new chapter of his story began. He studied, wrote books, and most importantly, attempted to write an autobiography. Publishers competed for the rights to his story. The court strictly ordered that Colton could not profit from his crime. Any money earned from his story would go to compensating victims. Still, his story sold. Documentaries were made, books published, and Hollywood planned a film adaptation. The Barefoot Bandit had become a legend, a name that blurred the line between crime and thrill. But behind this legend, the truth was far more complex. Colton's mother told the media, "My son is not a criminal. He is a misunderstood child. If he had had a proper environment in childhood, he would be a pilot today, not a prisoner." Meanwhile, those whose homes he had robbed said clearly, "No matter how romanticized it is, for us he was a thief. He stole our hard-earned belongings and made us feel unsafe." Colton was released from prison at the age of 25. The world had changed. The barefoot bandit was no longer a teenage criminal, but an adult. The question was, could he live a normal life? Did he try? He expressed interest in attending flight school, but his criminal past barred his dreams. He showed interest in technology and aeronautics. Some NGOs even invited him as a motivational speaker. But the image of the barefoot bandit was both romantic and dangerous, so every door remained half open, half closed. Today, hearing the name Colton Harrismore divides people's reaction. Some see him as a symbol of freedom and rebellion, a boy who challenged the system and outsmarted the police for years. Others see him only as a criminal, claiming the media glamorized him too much. The story of the barefoot bandit leaves many questions. Can circumstances push a person toward crime? Can the search for thrill and freedom lead a person down dangerous paths? And the biggest question, does society give such people a second chance, or must they always live under the shadow of their crime? Colton's name is now part of history among criminals, who are not just criminals, but also a cultural phenomenon. His barefoot escapes, stealing planes, flying in the sky, and outsmarting the FBI for years, all these made him a legend. But when the lights go out and reality sets in, he appears as a person who was a victim of poor decisions, a broken childhood, and an uncontrollable desire for thrill. The story of the barefoot bandit is both a warning and a mystery. A warning because no matter how glamorous crime seems, its end is always prison or ruin. And a mystery because many still believe that if Colton had been guided properly, he might have become America's most famous pilot.